also a teacher of adults. And the way he teaches us adults is with a sense of humor and with story. And all of you who are familiar with Waldorf know that we talk about, and we always have about head, heart, and hands, that the children learn clear thinking and heartfelt feeling, and then to use their doing for good. And when you hear the times that I've heard Eugene speak, he speaks from his whole self. And it's really wonderful to be who he is. And I am so privileged to get to introduce him and to welcome him to Jacksonville. It's really special. Thank you all for coming. Eugene, and I have to tell you, he's been in more than 100 schools in the U.S. and around the world doing what he's doing today here in Jacksonville.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice to see a group this large. And I hope that tonight I am able to share with you not only some thoughts about Waldorf education, but some thoughts about the real crisis that education in general in the United States is facing, and some things that you can do about it, whether or not you become Waldorf parents, and I sincerely hope that many of you do, but some things that you can take home with you, perhaps, at the end of this evening that will help to counterbalance the stress that your child might be under. Now, I come from the New York metropolitan area, and all around us, especially to the north in New England, are some of America's finest prep schools, schools that for generations have really been helping to create the elite that often holds great responsibilities in the United States. Now let me just read a letter from the headmaster of one of these prep schools. This is a very fine school called the Brunswick School in Greenwich, Connecticut, which some of you may know is the hedge fund capital of the United States. This was written in October 2 years ago, and he is quoting an author, a woman named Wendy Mogul, who's a clinical psychologist. He says, Stephen Frank, a 6th grade teacher, told me he won't be surprised if we soon face the largest class action suit in history. He fears that our children will sue us for stealing their childhoods and their futures. Our expectations of them are so high, the academic and extracurricular demands so extreme, that while they may be accepted to the Ivy League or other highly selective colleges, far too many will stumble once they arrive. Mary McGrath Lewis, director of undergraduate admissions at Harvard, writes that some of the incoming freshmen resemble dazed survivors of some bewildering lifelong boot camp. Now this headmaster, obviously an insightful individual, begs the faculty, the teachers, the staff, the parents, even the students themselves, he begs them to slow down, to stop scheduling so many things for themselves and for one another. Can we cut back on meetings, he asks? Can we have perhaps a few less intramural competitions? Can we schedule less of this and less of that? Here's a person who's in charge of a school and yet realizes that the rush forward, the accelerated, ever more crowded quality of student life is almost impossible for him to control. It seems to have a life of its own. So there's a somewhat pessimistic quality to this letter, and I'll keep it on this table, and you're welcome to look at it. Now, I'm speaking about New England, and as we know, 150, almost 200 years ago, New England's universities were primarily for divinity students, young men who would go on to become primarily Protestant ministers in Episcopalian churches throughout New England and the Northeast. But before they settled in for that work, they went off on clipper ships, and they visited especially the South Sea Islands, and there they had been trained in how to save the souls of the residents of these islands, who actually hadn't been aware that their souls needed saving. They were perfectly happy, as Margaret Mead was to see, even studying them many generations later. They had remarkably stable social groupings. They had remarkably tolerant and inherently workable means of relating to each other. But nonetheless, the divinity students were trained to go about this with zeal, and off they went. They got everybody to eat 3 square meals a day, which is part of saving your soul. They got everybody to wear clothing and to follow certain laws and rules, and they undoubtedly saved thousands of souls, although we're not sure because they decimated the population at the same time by bringing the common cold and a host of other bacteria to which these indigenous people had never been exposed. So they learned something. Missionaries are more like archaeologists today. First, they learn about the indigenous people whom they're going to visit, and then respectfully and slowly, they try to work with them. Well, good. We've learned something here. It only took us a century or so. But I would say that today we have a new moral equivalent of those divinity students. Who are they? They are those who don't go to theology schools anymore, but who go to schools of education. They're taught not so much how to save the souls of the children whom they're going to educate, but how to make them succeed, how to make them successful. And they enter the world of childhood. And I'm using an analogy which is always flawed, of course, so you can work it through for yourself. But I would say in much the same way that New England divinity students invaded a foreign world and tried to impose on it parameters that had nothing to do with that particular world, so we should think of childhood as a world unto itself as well. That children also live in a way on a beautiful archipelago of islands in a warm sea, perfectly happy in many ways, perfectly content to do what comes naturally, until they're told, no, no, you're in danger of losing your possibility of succeeding, of experiencing the good life, of finding the American way, whatever that happens to be at the time. We are going to teach you how to use hardware and software. We're going to teach you how to read and write and add and subtract and multiply and divide very, very quickly, because you have no idea what's facing you in first grade. In second grade, wait till you see the high-stakes tests. You're going to have to take a salvation today. And we are bringing this to children without necessarily asking them if they're interested. Now, we have a young lady in the back, and I would like to ask her how she feels about the state of modern education. How do you feel about the state of modern education? Well, you can see how deeply interested she is in such an issue. And why do you know, when you think of a child who goes into kindergarten, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, is that child closer chronologically to being an adult or to being a toddler? Obviously much closer to the toddler. Why do we immediately feel it's our business to pull that child 20 years ahead instead of looking back a year or two and seeing how much of the toddlerhood is still living there? How much of that is still persisting in the life of the child? I just want to give you an example from my own experience as a Waldorf teacher. I'm going to go into greater detail about how we try to work with this in the Waldorf school, but I will say in a general way that tonight's theme, No Childhood Left Behind, is really what informs Waldorf education. We want to be sure, before we get around to teaching children how to jump into the world of adulthood, that first and foremost, we allow them to have a childhood. Some children need a shorter childhood. Some need a much longer childhood. Some really need a childhood that persists well into adulthood. It really varies person by person. But I would say that it is impossible for anyone to step into adulthood in a healthy way unless they have been allowed to completely live through the childhood that they need. And I'll give you this example. My Waldorf school goes up to high school. We've had a high school since the mid-70s. And when I travel, if I know an alumnus is going to a university in the town or city that I'm going to be visiting, I may call them in advance and try to get together with them, visit their campus, and see what they're up to. And I hear this story again and again, especially from the girls. A young woman from the Waldorf school gets to her dormitory room in her freshman year, and she sets up her room. She's there first. Her roommate comes a little bit later. And everything that she sets up is stark and minimalist and modern. You know, black sheets and maybe a Keith Haring graffiti painting on the wall, and whatever, you know, especially leading edge music she might have heard at the latest Lilith festival or something like that. She brings in, college is now, it's time for her to be in the 21st century. She's really excited about that. Then her roommate comes, and maybe her roommate went to a very fine public school in Scarsdale, New York, known for its astronomically high SAT scores. Maybe she went to a fine private secondary school or a boarding school somewhere. But she's had all of the benefits of a fine, excellent, high-powered mainstream education. And she's probably hundreds of points ahead of the Waldorf graduate in her SAT scores, and probably has all kinds of advanced placement credits already in place. Well and good. How does she set up her side of the room? Big, big, fluffy pillows, and all kinds of lacy and fluffy and decorated coverlets. And then comes the print on the wall. A beautiful, beautiful print of Minnie Mouse kissing Mickey Mouse. And then some photographs of the Muppets, some of them actually autographed. And then comes a huge trunk filled with, one after another, on the bed, the stuffed animals. Out they come. When I was in Ithaca a couple of years ago, I went to the largest stuffed animal store I've ever seen in my life. 2 stories filled with incredibly beautiful bears and monkeys and rabbits and that sort of thing. And I asked the owner, who buys these? And she said, you know who buys these. It's all the Cornell kids. They buy it, all the Ivy League students up there. What are they looking for? Now it's college. Fantastic. I can finally have the childhood I've been wanting to have all of my life. So it's very interesting because one of the stereotypes about Waldorf education, and I should say that what's wonderful about Waldorf education is that there are so many stereotypes connected to it. They're all true. One of the stereotypes is that Waldorf kids remain somewhat arrested in their development all of their life because they hear fairy tales, they play games, they paint in bright colors and so on, they read slowly and all of that. Therefore, because we think in a fairly linear way, Therefore, they're always going to be 2 or 3 or 4 years behind. As we'll see, it actually doesn't work that way. You would imagine they're going to be childlike or childish all of their lives. Not true. When they get to college, they are done with their childhood. They finished it. When? When it was appropriate to do so, when they were children.